All right. So we are here with the always wonderful Phoenix Aurelius. Phoenix is an alchemist, educator, and wellness researcher, and also hosts his own podcast now called the Alchemi-Culture podcast. So if you haven't yet, you must go check that out because it's awesome. Um, so yeah, thank you for sharing your time with me today, Phoenix.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. You have some of the best questions of any interviewer that I've been on.
I really appreciate that. And as you know, I'm having a boy soon. He's coming in hot. So I've really been thinking a lot about the nature of souls, and kind of trying to really just like understand soul dynamics on a deeper level. And so, yeah, I think you may, I know, I may have got the notion of like what a divine spark is conflated with what a soul is. I'm not sure. So I'd originally kind of thought of a soul as like a portal to like a greater, ever present, eternal conscious field, like or like the mind of God or spirit of God. And I've thought of the spirit as like, the word we use to describe the animation or like the manifestation of a soul's motion kind of coming through the portal of a soul. And I don't know, you're someone who often talks about the soul. And so I look to guys like you to kind of help inform my personal understanding. And I'm wondering, does any of this kind of like conflict with your understanding of what a soul is, or what would you add? What do you think is important? And like, where do things like the ego or the individual observer kind of come into play? What's the function of a soul within a spirit, or all that?
Sure, yeah, those are good questions. No, none of what you said really conflicts with any of the information that I have. My opinions, my persuasions are more informed by alchemy and practical lab observance. And so, within the context of alchemy, everything has three things, sulfur and mercury and salt. And there are subdivisions of each of those philosophic essentials as well. And so, within the concept of sulfur or soul, there is a fixed sulfur and then there's a volatile sulfur. Fixed sulfur is what we would refer to as the ego, and it deals with like the personality, it deals with the way the individual comes across. Like in the herbal kingdom, when we extract the fixed sulfur, that's usually done with a solvent. And what you'll do is just, pour your solvent over a dried or even a fresh herbal material, and what causes the color inside of that tincture that's made by performing that process is largely, overwhelmingly the fixed sulfur of that material. So the color comes over, but that's also where oftentimes, many alkaloids will come over, or tannins, or other different types of chemical constituency that make that plant unique. Like for instance, if it's bitter, you might get a lot of tannins coming over in it. Whereas other plants that are more sweet or savory or have astringent qualities, they don't have quite so many tannins. And so all of that is part of the personality or the ego of that plant. And so when I try and think of an individual as being composed of essentially of those same things, what it seems like to me is that the ego is largely driven around many of its physiological characteristics that are intertwined with its purpose or its medicinal efficacy in the world. So what that would look like is the color of your skin, the color of your eyes, the color of your hair, the way that you dress, the music that you listen to, like all of those things. Some of the things you can see, some of the things that you can't see, that are all part of the personality of that individual, and that's what makes up the ego. So that's one part of the soul. The other part of the soul are the inherent talents and interests of that individual, and that would be referred to as the volatile sulfur or the volatile soul, sometimes referred to in modern metaphysical cosmology as the higher self. And what that looks like in the herbs is the essential oil of an herbal material. And not every herb actually contains any significant amount of volatile oils or essential oils. Some plants contain very small amounts of it, but it's still there, like rose, for instance, rose petals, or lemon balm. And some of them don't have really any at all, as far as I've been able to ascertain, like lady's mantle, for instance, horsetail. They have virtually none of those things. So every different being and person comes with different proportions, just like all the different plants do. And they have different roles to play within the context of the society, in the same way that the different plants have a different role to play within the context of the ecology that they're found in. So that's kind of the way that I take a look at it. In terms of like the portal of the soul and other things like that, those are metaphysical concepts. And even though I can neither confirm nor deny their actual presence. It seems to me like there are, what we could call superlunary kind of mansions where the soul hangs out or resides before incarnation, and a portal obviously indicating that that's like a door or an entry point from what I would conceive in my kind of druid philosophy as the other world, back into this philosophy of concrete reality and living a human mortal life and things like that. So all of those things could entirely be true, but I think that's really where humanity gets off key, is looking at and believing in things that can't necessarily be looked at or demonstrated. If we just focus on what we do have or what we can demonstrate, then we're sure not to slip up or to create too many divisions or rifts among people based in philosophy. So I try and personally not to get too caught up in all of those ideas, but just to stick with what I do know. And I do know that we can enhance through agricultural practices and ecological practices, we can enhance the amount of alkaloids or the potency of a plant by giving it better growing conditions that plant absolutely adores. Like even something as simple as changing the pH value or providing certain micronutrients to the soil. You can actually enhance the efficacy or the potency of that plant, either in its essential oil, that is to say its volatile soul, or its alkaloid and other chemically active constituents. And so from my part, when it comes to looking at the soul, that's what I try and do. And especially in your shoes as a parent, which I'm also in myself as a parent, it comes down to trying to create the best ecological environment for the plant, or in this case, my child, as I possibly can, so that they get the most development out of their soul as possible. And I guess that's the way I would look at it.
Love it. Yeah, and I mean, yeah, I guess as far as like soul manifestation or generation, maybe from a historical druidic perspective or alchemical or just anything you're kind of familiar with, like if I zoom out and kind of attempt to describe what's going on in the grand scheme, it's like I think of it kind of like, and this is just my speculation with my thoughts, but like pure potentiality and order out of chaos expressed through matter or energy. And so there's like there's like the prima materia or the monad at the top, like that raw, I guess you could call it like God energy or whatever, and then out of it created constructs via like its own mentation and then a material plane for it to come into and kind of individuate itself into like a multiplicity, like shattering itself into a multiplicity of souls embodied in their own individual multi-dimensional anatomies, like kind of, but ultimately all from that source. So like a unity created this potent illusion of separation in order to kind of like dance with itself in a sense. I don't know, how do you see all that, or is there kind of like um a I mean, not something you're married to as far as like a belief, but maybe like a general kind of understanding or way that you might kind of look at it? Do you have anything
Yeah,
like that?
yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm going to basically end up saying the same thing that you did, just in various alchemical terms, because that's a core part of the alchemical cosmology, is that everything comes from, some people call it the universal monad. Traditionally in Western alchemical literature, after the time of Paracelsus, is just referred to as the prima materia, which would mean like the first matter, or the first thing even sometimes is called. So what that is kind of that spiritual state of unity. And within the context of Kabbalah, which goes hand in hand with Western alchemical thought from the time of Renaissance Western alchemy really being developed, Kabbalah is always integrated into the philosophy. So it's said that there are four dimensions or four worlds, as they talk about it inside of Kabbalah. And so the most important one is called Atzilut. This is where everything originates from in the spiritual dimension. This is where the concept of prima materia really sits. And like you said, you kind of mentioned, and I won't be as like I won't be able to quote exactly what you said, but it's like it separates into two aspects. We would refer to that duality as Haile and chaos, which basically mean like order and our English concept of chaos, or sometimes those are known in the Latin as celestial niter and celestial salt. So celestial salt would be like the passive, or sometimes you could refer to it as like the feminine plane of that entire thing. And celestial niter is the active masculine side of that polarity. And what we would say is that this whole thing in this area relates to the causal plane. So, in terms of the most dense in Kabbalistic terms, you have Asaya, Yetzira, Braya, Atzilut. Atzilut is spiritual, Braya is causal, Yetzira is astral, Asaya is physical. And so this whole thing exists inside of Braya, which would be more or less the causal plane. And what we could refer to as celestial salt is actually the binary zero. And what we refer to as celestial niter is really the binary one. And everything that you are seeing, including this video right now, if you're watching it online, is all translated via digital coding that essentially is short code for long series of binary coding. Everything really goes back to that in digitalia. And in that same exact way, all of our physical analog reality is also composed of zeros and ones, although what that really looks like from a very practical perspective are angles, which are zeros, and ones, which are segments or lines. And that's what creates a geometric plane inside of the causal field. Series of segments and series of angles, and however many angles you have and however many segments you have end up creating particular geometries. And this goes back to Platonic thought with the 5 Platonic solids, well, the 6th, including the sphere, and concepts like that are really telling us like these are the basic foundational building blocks of the entire universe as far as we know it. And so in order to be able to form any of those geometric solids, which really exist in the astral, to be perfectly honest, the concept of 0 and 1, or the concept of angles and lines, or the concept of celestial salt and night, or chaos, or whatever, they need to exist. And so that's where unity slips into these two different qualities, is in order to be able to create a polarity of opposites, in order for new things to arise out of the one, but from the one, still existing within the one. Interestingly enough, those things need to exist. And then what we end up seeing is that the Platonic solids actually are the perfect embodiment of the astral archetypes. And so within the Hellenic, or the Greek theory of things, some people refer to these as Aristotelian, but that's, I think, a terrible misnomer, because even Pythagoras was talking about these long before Aristotle was around. But you have the tetrahedron, which is basically like a 3-sided pyramid. The tetrahedron is corresponding to fire. And what's interesting is that every single Archimedes was this excellent mathematician. He showed that every single Platonic solid actually has an inverse Platonic solid that it can connect to through what are called Archimedean progressions. And he shows that by snubbing and by doing these various things to the geometries, that a cube can turn into an octahedron into a cube. He also shows very clearly that a dodecahedron can turn into an icosahedron and vice versa. What was very interesting about all of that is that a tetrahedron, when you undergo the Archimedean route, of being able to create the inverse shape just turns into an upside down tetrahedron. So there's some interesting qualities about fire there, where we talk about exoteric fire and esoteric fire, or fire as an element, and then the secret fire or the hidden fire that is oftentimes referred to of the philosophers. And both of those seem to have correspondences within the geometries themselves. And again, I draw back to the geometry because anything that is substantial in any way, shape, or form is not just true in one plane, it's true in all planes. So if you can look at it physically and it's there, then it makes sense in the physical. If you can look at it mathematically, then it's true in the astral. If you can take a look at it through binary coding, then it's true in the causal. And if it all sources back to a singular origin point that you can draw through all of the dimensions equally, then it becomes a perennial truth. It's something that's true regardless of the perspective that you're looking at it from. And so 100% of my own personal philosophies try and work towards these things that I can see as being truly perennial and working, time and time again, regardless of the perspective that you see them from. So yeah, with that being said, you have fire being a tetrahedron, you have air being an octahedron, you have water being a pentagonal dodecahedron, you have earth being a cube, and then spirit, ether, sometimes referred to as well, or a quintessence, a quintessential balance, being an icosahedron. And so these are the 5 real shapes, and then of course the 6th being the sphere. Which is really more than a shape, that is something that is a prerequisite that creates a piece of sacred geometry. All of the points have to fit equally and congruently inside the sphere in order to be considered a Platonic solid. And then from there, the concept is that everything that exists is some combination of all of those elemental forces, just in different proportions or different sizes. And that's what ultimately ends up creating different predispositions, why maybe some person in their soul might have more tetrahedron causal and astral energy, which leads us to say that they might have a fiery disposition in their soul, for instance, and different types of things like that. And that translates to the plant realm, the metallic realm, the human realm, the animal realm, basically every different kingdom that you can imagine. So that historically, within the context of alchemy, since the time at least of Paracelsus, that has been the way that it has been taught and passed on, in the way that it was passed on to me, and something that I have found to be particularly relevant in my work. But yeah,
that's wow. I haven't really quite heard it put like that. That's really fascinating though, and I'm gonna have to kind of go over that a couple more times and contemplate it, because I love it. Especially anything that relates to like sacred geometry, and I don't know, I like that stuff.
yeah, me too. In fact, I used to own a metaphysical store called Sacred Geometry, where I would teach
Oh,
classes about these types of things. And Robert Lawler's work was really influential to me, especially around 2007 to 2008, 2009, somewhere in there, where I deep dive into that work, and really drew a lot out of just taking a look at individual geometries, letting themselves make their impression on me, and then working with the Platonic solids. I have little sacred geometry forms of every different Platonic solid, and just being
one.
able to spin them and work with them and be like, oh, you know what, if I look at it from this angle, that's actually this plant and the way that it blooms, and so
Wow.
on and so forth. And
I want to get some of those for my boy.
yeah, exactly, those are the
Yeah.
toys, man, those are the
Yeah.
toys.
It's the real toys. So yeah, it's cool too, and to hear it kind of explained with kind of gives some shed some light on the individuality of the soul in terms of like the geometric approach that you mentioned. That was cool. And then and yeah, and like in terms of soul dynamics or characteristics, I guess you could say like, so souls are the thing that is incarnated. The souls are like the holders of memory. They have a volition, and by that we mean they have a will and an individual unique trajectory or kind of determination. And this would kind of be based off of like the multidimensional design and astronomical influences, perhaps past life influences. So it's kind of like they're the sum total experiences of a individual consciousness node that's kind of like ever changing and evolving, maybe something like, I don't know.
Sure. I mean, one thought as you were saying that comes up for me is that it's said that sulfur is a combination. Sulfur, basically, if we were to separate sulfur into its parts, even beyond like just fixed sulfur and volatile sulfur, it's that it's really can be conceived of as a combination of the elements of fire and air. So what happens when you mix a tetrahedron with an octahedron? And really what that ends up being is a star tetrahedron. So if you place a tetrahedron at each of the 8 faces, each of the triangular 8 faces of an octahedron, that creates a star tetrahedron. So to me, on a sacred geometrical level, that's exactly what the soul basically is. And it's a combination, therefore, in its total shape of external fire and internal fire with the core of air, which is a very interesting thing to think about and to talk about.
Wow.
But let's draw it out of that mathematical plane and look back at it a little bit more practically. What that means to me is that fire corresponds to Atzilut, to the spiritual. And so the soul has some sort of goal or some sort of root inside of that spiritual plane, inside of the world of Atzilut, that tells us that the nature of the soul is in some way designed to help perfect or bring experience back to unity consciousness. And so this is where I feel like so many people look at the soul, especially the higher aspects of the soul, like your inherent talents and interests, as lending to creation, as being meaningful, that every soul has a purpose. That's where that concept comes from. And then the air component of it, air is really interesting because, as you know, hot air and cold air are the two divisions, or heat and the absence thereof, if we were to look at it under a modern science. I like to refer to cold as its own force. I call it coolth, heat and coolth.
That's interesting that you mentioned that. I had brought that up in a previous podcast with somebody that I did, but anyway, keep going because I want to hear what you have to say about this.
Yeah, so just those two dynamics really are responsible for probably 75 to 80% of the weather patterns on Earth, where hot air rises, cool air condenses, and there's a critical point where cold air is trying to condense from the upper atmosphere and hot air is trying to rise to the upper atmosphere, and they can't move past each other. So what do? They can't move like this, so they move like this instead. And that sends cold streams this way and warm streams this way, and that creates wind as we know it, which wind is different than air because, the air in a room will never separate a pile of salt on the table. But if I, with my breath using wind, direct that air, it can scatter all of the salt that's set up as a mound on a table and just scatter it everywhere, right? So wind is a force, whereas air is just an element. And that force is something to be reckoned with in the same way that every person's soul has a type of force, especially their personality, their fixed sulfur, their ego, and the way that they come across. And the ego isn't even remotely always bad or always something that needs to be, shamed or tried to transcend it. It needs to be harnessed really in such a way that it's working in congruency with the direction of that person's inherent talents and interests to perform the mission that unity has kind of set out for it. And if those two things are aligned, I think that that's really the ideal purpose of a person's soul, and why they have a personality to begin with. If you can align it with what your true purpose is in life and just go with it, now you're really a force to be reckoned with. And so that's where I feel that heat or fire as the tetrahedron and air coming together to form that star tetrahedron, the octahedron, the tetrahedron, you place all of these around you, now you have the star tetrahedron. That's really what it is it's hot air in a certain way that gives rise to buoyancy, that lifts things up and creates ultimately that force of wind as it comes back into the condensation of the upper atmosphere. And so yeah, that's kind of what comes to mind for me when you were talking about some of those concepts, is that personality gets developed specifically for that purpose. And sometimes we lead astray because we're not sure or embarrassed about, or otherwise not fully willing to embrace our true soul purpose. But it's actually easy. It's
Yeah,
just very easy. Just do what comes inherently natural to you.
that's fast. Yeah. So, and then with that being said, so like in terms of the spirit, which I guess you'd call the mind, right? And the mind, do you think of this as like kind of like quote unquote the mind of God, or like the source field? Like, so is it that everyone has access to the same mind or field of infinite mind or limitless potential? And does that mind or spirit act or animate or helps you animate the soul and act as kind of like a prime mover, but through the lens of that unique geometry of the individual soul? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I guess I would have to start off just by defining terminology a little bit better, because I would actually say that mind is sulfur, that mind is
Okay.
soul,
Okay.
because it's, again, if we break down etymology and the way that words are created, mind, our term of mind and psyche are pretty synonymous. And psyche is comes from the Greek word psyche, which means soul. Literally, that's the way that it translates. And so for me, the way a person thinks about things, that is a huge reflection of their inherent talents and interests, and also their ego and personality and all those things. So for me, that's soul. And I think that that has a whole lot less to do with the spirit than it has to do with the soul. So in that way, I would just have to say, like, where do you sit on that, and where should we create and take the discussion from there?
Well, that's fascinating. And I actually think that makes a lot more sense, because I think that was something I kind of have been wrestling with in my head, I guess, just from hearing different perspectives and trying to relate and correspond, sulfur, uh, sulfur, spirit and salt to their different correspondences. And I've kind of been thinking about how, like you mentioned, the psyche, and yeah, you're right, that's associated with the soul. And so these are like the things that I'm trying to get clear, at least for myself. And then so like, and then when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking of like the idea of channeling, or even just like inspiration alone, or these kinds of things. Would you say that these typically occur as a result of the attunement with, or the openness and or alignment with that kind of, I don't know if it would be through the soul to the spirit, that is kind of helping animate it, um uh like theoretically, like, if that would it have that kind of refining effect, if it like kind of aiding its trajectory, like in a complementary way, and like sort of a higher order expression, or helping to evolve the soul, being in kind of like an open, aligned fashion, like how you're mentioning earlier. You're saying when we were talking about the soul and kind of just letting your natural kind of way of being be. I get that's kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
my, but and then how I was relating that to like the idea of like channeling or inspiration. Um, I was wondering, are these like occurring as somebody becomes more in alignment or becomes more attuned to that? Does that is that the thing that allows for when people say, like, if they were to be channeling information, or be inspired, or like have these inspirations, or that place of the imagination where these ideas are, where we are accessing the imagination.
Sure, yeah. Um, so I guess to tap into Jungian psychology with the concept of imaginatio, or imagination, that definitely corresponds to the soul. I think what allows a person to really tap into their intuition and their psychic faculties is that soul aspect, and how much they allow themselves to just be inspired. Because imagination really doesn't come from inside. I disagree a little bit with Jung on this, but imagination comes from inspiration from what we see outside of us or what we hear outside of us. We take a kernel, even just a little bit, and then we personalize it. We make it our own. And that's where our own inspiration or our own imagination really tends to come from. Even dreams, all right? Like you might watch a movie and then have a dream that is somewhat based on that movie. Is that actually like your own soul talking? Or is that its own way of taking in that information and regurgitating it? I absolutely love what Joseph Campbell presented, and I forget which lecture of this it is, but I know that he had a movie on this. It could have even possibly been in the hero's journey, but he talks about three different real layers of conscious, subconscious, and unconscious existing. If the conscious deals with your ego and the subconscious deals with your higher self, your soul, then the unconscious is really dealing with spirit. And I think that oftentimes what's happening is that your conscious mind, like for instance, in the example of you watching a movie and then having a dream later about these things, is that the conscious mind watches these things and it doesn't know how to actually process all of the information that's contained inside of there. It might get the basic theme, it might understand the characters, it might sympathize with the emotions of those characters and things like that. So it's picking up on a great deal of information consciously, most likely, especially depending on the level of awareness of the individual who might be perceiving it. But there's still so much other information. That's just, mostly what I would call astral information, physical and astral information that a person is looking at. Like, is this character sexy? Is this character, not sexy? Is this character, really athletic or things like that? Those are physical details. Then we start to take a look at what is this character thinking, or what is the plot of the story? All of those types of things. Those are astral details, right? So that's what the conscious mind can usually pick up on. And those are typically earth and the first part of water, or what I would call the Kabbalistic planes of Hasaya, and the first part, the first half of Yetzirah. Then you have the second half of Yetzirah and the first half of Braya, which is to say the higher astral and the lower causal information that is making its way into the body. And how do you process that? Well, I think that oftentimes that's what gets recapitulated in dreams, is it uses archetypes, very largely astral archetypes, to recapitulate ideas to yourself that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. I think the stream is like, because there's periods of sleep, of course, where you're not dreaming at all. You're not even in REM sleep yet. You're like moving deeper, 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 REM, and then you come out of it, and then you go back into it, okay, according to the best modern scientific information. So what that looks like to me is that you're taking something in, you can't process it all, and so your conscious mind has to relate to your subconscious mind what it just saw. Then your subconscious mind relates to the unconscious mind what it just saw. So it's like taking information from a cloud and downloading it to your local computer, and then backing it up from the computer back to a server-based source so that it can save that information. Now, every single time that you do that, there's a data conversion that's taking place in order to send it to a different location and in order to correlate it to the programming parameters of that particular system. And then the unconscious mind recapitulates what it thinks that it has seen back to the subconscious mind. And then during REM sleep, I think that the subconscious mind creates images that are more potent for you than that movie was in speaking to your own thing and moving you emotionally and physically. And obviously it has to be somewhat disturbing, because the amygdala which is responsible for processing pretty much all of the difficult to process emotions in our life. That's the most active gland during our REM sleep period. So it's taking all that shit that we don't really know how to do, and it's like very disturbing to us, and we have to process that in our sleep. And so I think during that subconscious period where the unconscious is relating back to the subconscious what it thinks that it's seen, that's where we're again creating astral imagery that speaks more directly to us as individuals, so that if we're aware during those dreaming periods and if we remember our dreams, then that imagery can be available to us back in our conscious mind. And this is where I do like the Jungian practice of analysis or dream analyzation, but I don't like to do it in that Jungian way because it seems so fruity and like kind of grasping at straws and all these other things. For me, it ends up taking on a much more practical kind of perspective. Like, for instance, if I see that in my dream I'm cutting my sister in half, what that actually might mean to me is that somebody who is very dear and close to me, most likely a female, needs to have, for their own benefit or for my benefit, I need to create some form of separation between us, because what does cutting in half do? It separates that individual. And so for me, it's like separating that individual or separating my experience so I'm not so tied into that individual in certain ways. Like, I may not, that may be a message for me that I'm not to share information with that individual all about me, maybe just part of the information or half of who I am, or other types of things like that. And not trying to grasp at straws in terms of like, oh, I feel like it could be this, and getting way too heady about it. It's like, just take the archetypes as they show up, remove yourself from the emotion, and find what is actually being said by the actions or the symbology that shows up. So it's like constantly conscious, subconscious, unconscious, back from the unconscious to the subconscious to try and speak to the conscious, so that we can really embody the entirety of the experiences that we have. And unfortunately, most people move so fast in the modern day that reflection on a single experience, even like a movie, happens in a matter of minutes for most people, hours for people who are a little bit more developed. It's rare that people do kind of what I have trained myself to do. Just take a week for every bit of sensory input that you have to really let it process and sink through, and let those channels of communication and conversion happen.
Definitely, yeah. And I think, like, on kind of that note of the imagination, it reminded me of the conversation that you actually had with, I think it was, he has a podcast called Bathing with God. What's his name? Something Olson, or Joel Olson or something. Does that ring a bell to you? It was
Oh
a
man,
real.
I
You've been
hate
on
to
so
say
many.
this, but I've had so many conversations with so many people over the last couple of years, especially on concepts like this, that they kind of all blur together for me.
Yeah, it's
So,
fascinating. I'd recommend people check it out. But I know that we are kind of getting close on time, so I'll try to ask you a couple more questions that I wanted to get to.
we've got about a half hour more. So
Okay, cool. Then so let's take this notion of what many people call sin. And I kind of started to look at sin in the sense of, the definition, like to miss the mark, and maybe akin to swimming against the current of the will, or like a psychologically disorganized mess or mind virus of some kind, perhaps. I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts on that? There's a lot to the idea of sin. Um, I'm just curious, what are yours? What do you think about like this? Because I think people define it differently, and they have
yeah,
their own definitions that they apply to it based on what their belief structures are, perhaps.
sure.
But in general, kind of like, if you were to kind of try to summarize like the feeling, the what you feel people are talking about when they're saying, like, if you were to sin, what would you think that means?
Yeah, so I guess I would just have to say preliminarily, I wasn't always pagan. In fact, I was a Christian scholar for the first half of my life, and that's what ultimately led me to being pagan. You follow the Christian narrative far enough, you realize that there's so many pagan elements to it. So, as a Christian scholar, I can say that the word sin etymologically has its roots to an interpretation that we would now just refer to as error. And it just basically means that somebody is making an error. What I would say that sin actually is, now this is my own interpretation. I'm no longer speaking as a Christian scholar or pagan beliefs or any of these other things. Um, for me, what it appears like sin is a transgression of your own conscience. And your conscience corresponds to what your soul is here to do and what it feels good doing and what it knows to be right and true in order to stay on its path. So that there's a wide variety of things that can be sinning. For instance, it may not necessarily be a sin, quote unquote, within any sort of particular dogma. And sometimes in certain dogmas it may be, but to say, smoke a pipe of cannabis every once in a while. Okay, that there's no particular like you're going to hell if you're doing this within Christian cosmology, at least within certain Christian cosmologies. However, if it's something that derides you from your path or that stops you from feeling fulfilled, I guess I should say, in your life, then that is a sin for that individual. So it's very highly subjective. However, there are many others, and even the same person at different timelines, where that may be entirely medicinal to the soul. And so it's very highly contextualized, and no one action, no one behavior can really be considered sin. To look at it like that is just exceptionally myopic and very spiritually not progressed not developed, not matured. So to take into account what sin could be is just, from my definition, again, anything that is a transgression of conscience. And I think that's also what opens people up. Interestingly enough, you use the term virus. It's like a type of spiritual virus. When you do those things, they tend to break your discipline. And discipline is how you build your spirituality within the alchemical and Western esoteric mystery traditions. You build your spirituality, which is to say the amount of energy that you can animate the soul and the body with, by developing certain disciplines that continue to feed that energy, that continue to develop the soul and the psychic faculties, and that continue to develop the body and to keep both of them strong, so that ultimately all three of them are working with the same amount of energy and they can do really great things. They're harmonized in their capacity, the soul, the spirit, and the body. So yeah, I think a sin would be anything that breaks that ability for you to either keep a healthy body or keep a healthy soul. And that's highly contextualized and very, very subjective to the individual.
Well, I agree 1000%. I couldn't have said it better. Yeah, I'm glad that you just said all that.
Cool.
So as far as soul incarnation is concerned, kind of wondering like your thoughts on the birth or rebirth of souls. Is the birth of a soul, I mean, we may or may not have a response to this. Is the birth of a soul just like a packet of energetic memory potential, kind of splintering off from like that mind of God? Or is there more to it? Like, can a soul be created perhaps in some esoteric method? I believe I heard you mention some old Arabic alchemical text, of which alluded to imbibing souls within mechanical constructions.
Yeah.
Something like that. I want to hear
Yeah.
everything about this.
Yeah, this is really interesting. And of course, the further you look back in alchemy, you begin to see that there's no like one cosmology to the alchemical corpus, and that alchemy tends to be filtered through whatever civilization or society ends up using it. And so within that particular era of Arabic alchemy, which was like 600 to 900 AD, we see some really interesting practices where, like I said, they would take what we would refer to as like mechanical things, and through magic imbue souls and spirits into them so that they could sing and fly about of their own volition, or at least that's the way that some of the sources talk about these things. And it's a very, very steampunk notion, actually. Like if we were to modernize it, it's just like steampunk stuff, like taking gears and flying things. So at any rate, that's always kind of fascinated me, and I've been very interested in that. I don't know if a person is capable of creating a soul, or whether there are certain disembodied entities, meaning they already have soul and a spirit, and they're just looking for a body. And that's actually what I think, based on my own observations, that a lot of these Arabic magicians would have been doing, is that they weren't creating a soul, they weren't creating a spirit, they were calling a spirit that already has the volition to fly, to want to do things, and being able to build a mechanical or biomechanical kind of body or system for it. And in fact, this shows up in Irish mythology a little bit as well, uh, where it possibly Maclir, Manana Maclir's Inbar, which was one of the mythical horse that would drive his chariot over sea and land. That very well could have been a biomechanical creation of a very similar sort, actually. So it's just, I don't know about that, but here's what I can say. Okay, where does the essential oil from a plant come from? Well, it actually comes from the waste materials and the bioreplication and biosynthesization of new elements from the plant roots as acted upon and made available to the plant roots from the archaea, the fungi, and the bacteria in the soil. So in that way, the death of other materials, minerals, being decomposed by fungi, bacteria, archaea, become available to the root system and get biosynthesized into various things that we now know as chemically as terpenes or essential oils. All of that seems to me to say that life comes from life and that life simultaneously comes from death. That mineral, say manganese or magnesium or iron or nickel or whatever it is that's in the soil, had to be decomposed through the bacteria to turn into, say, some form of acid and some form of other enzyme and maybe possibly other nutrients, or possibly even a biochemical transmutation to another metal, like manganese turns into iron and iron to manganese. And so that becomes available to the plant, and then the plant begins to break that down and biosynthesize it the same way that the human organism does in order to turn it into its essential oil content. Now, that's the volatile soul of the plant. And where does the color of that plant come from? The same types of processes are leading to that. So is the soul actually created by the soil? And is the soil actually created by the microorganisms? Or is it all part of one big, very vast, grand working collaboration between multiple different entities? And the answer for me seems to be it's that last one. And that's actually like a big part of the quote unquote mystery of life, is like, where do things come from? But I tend to think about things happening on a very scalable, holographic, and fractal manner. So if they're happening like that in the soil, and that's the way the plant is creating it, with almost the exact same dynamics just applied to the different kingdom that we're talking about, there must be similar dynamics at play for the development and the incarnation of human souls. That when a soul dies, or when a person dies, it breathes out into the atmosphere of this world. And it's available not just to one organism, but to any of those organisms that are growing in that soil to be reincarnated and live back through in a different life cycle. And if you take a look at what it is for a seed, for instance, that you put in the soil to sprout, that contains the potential, like every seed that you plant of rosemary is all going to have the same terpene profiles, more or less, different slightly more, say, alpha toluene or other toluene, I think is what it is, or other different, alpha pinene, delta pinene, all of these different types of terpenes in it. It's going to have more or less each different plant depending on where it's planted. But isn't that true of humans too? Like if you take your personality and you weren't raised, say, in Gilbert, Arizona, but you were raised in Tokyo, Japan, now you're going to have an entirely different personality because the surroundings, the environment that you grew up in is going to cater or foster more or less of a particular constituency. But are you the same soul? I would say, yes, you are. You're the same seed, and that seed and the fertile conditions happens more biologically through male-female interactions than it does with just seeds and planting them in the earth and letting them sprout. So it's slightly different process, but I think the same dynamics are involved. So I'm not 100% sure as to whether souls can be created or whatever, but I do know through experience that they can be imbued. And in the points where they are imbued, they always have to come with the spirit. Like, for instance, if I want to imbue an essential oil into a salt, I can do that, and I can ultimately end up making like a soap. But the second that I add spirit to it or alcohol, now it begins to form a stone and take on a whole new incarnation as a solid piece of material that before, in just adding an essential oil and salts together from a plant, it doesn't do that. So I can see that when there is a spirit added to the soul and then added to a body, then it really begins to be born anew and take on a whole new manifestation in such a way that it's like an octave within music. You start off at a lower octave, and once you separate out the soul, the spirit, and the body, and you put it all back together, it's like creating a new octave of the same thing. It's higher and the frequency is faster, but it's essentially the same.
Wow, yeah, that's fascinating to think about. It kind of it makes me think of, I think it's something I heard I think I was talking to like Daniel Wiseman about uh collecting dew, and he was talking about something along the lines of whatever kingdom it first comes in contact with, it's kind of bound to that kingdom. So say if it, is collected in a metallic vessel, it'd be more bound to that metallic kingdom. And then so in regards to something being able to kind of like a vessel that's being designed and able to contain a soul in terms of like a mechanical construction properly, I would wonder if it would have to be designed to kind of like contain that human DNA coding of who knows how many years of evolutionary complexities building on top of one another, and perhaps take that on in order to be able to express that form of consciousness or something.
You're right. Now, water is the universal mercury, meaning that that's spirit. So whatever the spirit touches, this is the same thing with distilling ethanol. If you distill out a metal, then it should ideally be used for the metallic kingdom. That's why we distill in glass, which has no determination, actually. And it can be used for anything, because glass is actually a liquid in and of itself. It may be made of minerals, but it is a liquid. It's the slowest moving liquid that we know of on Earth at this time. So with that being said, you're distilling a liquid out of a liquid that can take on no determination. There's no interaction between them. If you were to distill, say, out of a coconut husk, that would ideally, it's not impossible. It would be a little difficult, but it would take on the determination of the vegetable kingdom. The spirit would in that case. And the same thing, like if you start with material that you're distilling within the vegetable kingdom and you ferment that and distill that, then that obviously has a determination to the vegetable kingdom. Whereas if you do a pyrolytic distillation of a metal acetate, for instance, the spirit that you get out of that is largely going to be an acetone. That is ideally determined to the metallic kingdom. And what's cool actually about alchemy is that you can use some of those metallic kingdom solvents in mineral work or in herbal work and create new permutations of things, new combinations, new permutations of things that nature is unlikely to create in any large or significant quantity on her own, and to be able to see what happens when you do that. But it's not altogether something that happens regularly. So that's one thing about water. And Daniel Wiseman is rad. He's one of the guys that I really like. I think aside from myself, it's Daniel Wiseman, Colin, God, I forget his other name, but most of them are in Canada besides myself, who are really looking at alchemy from a more scientific perspective and testing things and retesting things over and over and over to be able to see, like, what does this do and how does this do this? And he and I have had some interesting conversations too, just about ethyl acetate work. So yeah, I really like what he says. I'll have to check into that episode about the water determination, dew collection and stuff. But yeah, it's a mercury, so it has a different determination. The soul is going to have an even different determination based on its origin point. And I think this is where humanity is really interesting and odd, is that I think some souls incorporate into the physical experience of humanity, carrying over every different type of soul determination that there is. And this isn't unique to me. This is something that dates all the way back to Pythagoras. He says that if a human lives a good life, a fulfilling life, that it will eventually degenerate, because humanity is kind of like the least evolved form of soul expression. It's the least pure, but it's the most evolved. Let me put it like that. It's the least pure, meaning that it's made of, even when you eat, you're eating animal materials, you're eating vegetable materials, you're eating mineral materials, and the entire organism is designed to break all of those apart. That's not exactly true of all other organisms. In fact, once you step down to the animal kingdom, you're mostly just taking in vegetable materials, you're taking in mineral materials. And then you step down to the vegetable kingdom, you're just taking in mineral materials. And then the mineral kingdom is just taking in metallic materials. So metallic is the most pure because it's a single atomic expression of its soul incarnation. But how many metals do you have in your body right now? You have potassium, you have magnesium, you have manganese, you have calcium, you're the composition of everything. So humans are very not pure, but as a result, very evolved. We've come to encompass the entirety of everything that there is in that way. And so I think that that's where human consciousness is really such a rare and beautiful and cool gift, because it is the culmination of all of those things. You have 100% of the wisdom of potassium inside of your body. You have 100% of the wisdom of carbon inside of your body, of all of the, elemental elements that we know of today, and of all of the animals that you've ever eaten, and of all, at least of the parts of them that you've eaten. If you've eaten the liver or the heart or the brain or the eyes or other things, then you contain even more of those components within yourself. And that's what's cool. We're like a living computer, and everything that we see is like a micro SD card stored with data, right? You put this into your mouth, that's you inserting the chip into the organism of the organism computer, so to speak, that is you. And so nature is a type of living data.
Definitely. So I might have more time for one more question or so.
Yeah.
Debating between talking about evolved mercury or the ether and the aether. So which would you rather go with on that?
Well, I think insofar as time is concerned, I could definitely sort out ether versus aether
Okay, so
pretty simply.
this is something that I'm just really attracted to the ether of things for some reason. But and I want to talk also about ether, ether versus aether, aether. And I've heard ether used to describe, the fifth element or the quintessence. It's like, and then I've heard ether, like the ether body, as like that vital body or subtle body, that lowest layer of the human energy field. And then I've also heard ether be divided into four ethers: the warmth ether, the light ether, the chemical or tone, and then the life ether. And it's all of that is of which I understand to be that those kind of cosmic formative forces. And then there's aether as like the medium that waves travel through, I guess. So I'm just curious, any of your thoughts or insights into the ether or aether of things in general?
Sure. So etymologically, they actually share the same source. Ether, as we spell it ether these days in English, at one point was always spelled aether. So etymologically, they have the same source, and they actually share the same archetype, and they delineate almost the same. They've just come to talk about different things. So like chemically, when we talk about ether, we're talking about either petroleum ether or we're talking about diethyl ether. And those are solvents that are able to pull a quintessence, or a non-polar solvent in particular, that are able to pull a quintessence out of the material that they are tincturing, or that they are used as a menstruum for. And so Paracelsus would have referred to those as a circulatum, or more as a circulatum than as an alkahest, but that they're able to pull out a heavy quintessence, and that's why they're called ether. It's because the menstruum itself doesn't take any predominance over any of the four elements: fire, air, water, or earth. They're all in equal proportion and perfectly balanced, so that you can't say there's more fire than air, or more water, or more air, or any of these other things. It's all perfectly balanced, and that's technically what ether or a quintessence is. They're one and the same. And aether is the exact same thing. Simultaneously, Paracelsus didn't use the term aether or ether during his era. So this is, 1520s to 1540s, really, when he was active in writing. Um, he used the term archeus. And the archeus is what exists halfway between the physical and halfway between the astral. And that is today the exact same definition of where the etheric body sits. So the astral body would be, in Vedic terminology, the chakras are made as the energy centers within the body, and there's chakras all over. People are very aware of the 7 primary chakras from crown to root. But then you also have them in the palms of your hands. You have every gland has one, every joint has one, so on and so forth. And they're energy emanations that then, through the nadis, the subtle energy pathways of the body, are able to be channeled to inform physical reality as how to form. And so these nadis are actually the etheric body. They're halfway between the chakras and the physical body. And in the exact same way, within the concept of Taoist medicine, you would have possibly, say, your burners, the 3 burners, or even the principles of Jing, Qi, Shen as the astral forms that exist as philosophical essentials. And then they are able to be channeled out then through the and the organs as well. I guess you could refer to like spleen, liver, heart, large intestine, small intestine, all 3 burners, all of those types of things. Those would all be the organ systems of the East. Those would all considered to be the astral seats of those places. And then the meridian lines and the points that move out through the body from those, or that correspond to those, would be considered to be the etheric body. And so ether does allow waves to pass through it. And so aether, as we would talk about it, AETHER, does have waves that pass through it. And it's the point where waves actually condense into physical matter. So if you want to think of it as such, it's like if I hook up a distillation kit and I pass my vapors through an actual condenser, the condenser itself would be the etheric body, because it takes something that is very subtle and condenses it into something that is more gross and tangible. And so it's that halfway point between the physical and the astral.
Wow. Alrighty then. I love it. Um, well, I want to get you to, if there's any closing thoughts, any notes that you would like to comment on before we wrap it up, please go ahead, or point people in the direction of where they can find you and your work and what you're up to and any of that. So
Sure, yeah. If anybody listening to this has really caught on to some of these concepts and wants to learn more, I have a bunch of different types of interviews that have been done, including several by Sky himself. On my website at phoenixaurelius.org, just scroll to the media tab, and then from there you can go to interviews, and I've got some stuff there. I'm also starting to put out my own content, like we mentioned at the beginning of the call, through the Alchemi-Culture podcast, which Alchemi-Culture is a philosophy that I kind of have put together based on alchemy, ecology, nature, agriculture, and just seeing everything in a much more holistic perspective, where everything fits together in a nice, seamless way, using alchemical archetypes and logic and cosmology, so that we can more fully interact and appreciate interact with and appreciate the things that we see around us. So there's always that. And for those who are interested in supporting my work at the Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy, I've got a huge apothecary full of spagyric medicines that we sell. And then I also have various membership programs and other things like that that people can contribute to if they like my work and want to continue hearing more of this. And every little bit of funding, like, it allows me to spend time doing interviews like this and other things like that in non-paid ways, so that when you purchase spagyrics and stuff, so that I can devote my time to sharing all my knowledge, not just sitting here learning it and scraping away at trying to make a living. So yeah, 100% of all of our proceeds come from people like you who are interested in supporting this work and just supporting what I do and how I share information. So
Beautiful. Thank you so much again for all your time, Phoenix.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sky. And let's get together. I'd like to have you on my podcast too. We should talk a little bit
I'd
more.
love to.
You're always asking me questions. I got some for you now.
All right, let's do it.
All right. Sounds good, brother. All my love.